The moment I asked about the wedding date, my son's smile froze. "It was yesterday," he said, voice too calm. Still, I didn't speak. My eyes locked on his as the words twisted in my chest. As his hand slid the photo across the table, my stomach dropped. Vanessa. The woman who'd stolen everything from me was now standing beside him, her hand in his. While the air grew heavier, I realized this wasn't just a wedding. It was a betrayal that ran deeper than blood. That's when I knew. He wasn't just my son anymore. He was her pawn. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence. It lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Eleanor walked into the cafe, the bouquet of wildflowers clutched in her hands, the anticipation heavy in her chest. Today was supposed to be simple, a final check on the wedding plans. Michael had been her best friend for years, and they'd talked about this day more times than she could count. She had imagined herself helping him plan, organizing the last details, but today felt strange. Michael was already sitting at a corner table looking as effortless as always, his dark hair tousled in that way that seemed both deliberate and natural. The kind of guy who always looked like he had just stepped off a runway, even in the middle of a conversation. When he saw her approach, he smiled, and for a brief second, Eleanor felt a wave of comfort. It was just brunch. They'd take care of things, finalize the seating chart, and everything would be fine. "Hey," she greeted as she slid into the seat across from him, placing the flowers on the table. "Ready for the big day?" Michael didn't immediately respond. He just looked at her, his expression too calm, too composed. For a moment, Eleanor thought he was waiting for something, but it didn't quite make sense. She waited for him to speak, her smile faltering slightly. Then, he said it, his voice even, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "It was yesterday." Eleanor froze. The words didn't register right away. Her mind flitted between confusion and disbelief, trying to process what he had just said. She laughed, thinking maybe it was some sort of joke, some weird miscommunication. "Wait, what?" She blinked, then shook her head. "Michael, we were supposed to meet today to—" "It was yesterday," he repeated, his eyes meeting hers without a flicker of doubt. Eleanor's stomach lurched. She stared at him, struggling to comprehend. He didn't look upset, didn't seem the least bit surprised by her reaction. Just calm. Too calm. He pulled out his phone, swiped to a photo, and slid it across the table. Eleanor looked down at the screen, and her breath hitched in her throat. A beach. The light warm and soft. The ocean rolling gently at the edges of the frame. Michael stood beside a woman, his hand resting in hers. And the woman. Eleanor's stomach dropped when she saw her. Vanessa Caldwell. She felt the air in the room thicken, the bouquet in her hand suddenly feeling like a foreign object. Cold. Heavy. Her fingers tightened around the stems as she looked at the photo again. "Vanessa. You remember her, don't you?" Michael's voice was gentle, like he was explaining something trivial. "You two have so much history." Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest. History. The word felt like a weight dragging her under. She'd met Vanessa a few years ago when she had started showing up at their social circle. Friendly, charming, always smiling. The kind of woman who could wrap people around her finger without even trying. Eleanor had never thought much of it. Never thought much of her. Until now. Until this moment. Her mouth went dry. "You're married?" The words felt impossible to form, but they came out anyway. Shaky. Disbelieving. Michael didn't flinch. He didn't seem surprised. "It wasn't the right time to tell you," he said, as if explaining something simple. Eleanor's brain scrambled, searching for the right words. "You didn't tell me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, like she was trying to wake from some nightmare that felt far too real. But I've been helping you plan. We've been. I didn't want to hurt you, Michael said, his voice soft, almost apologetic. Eleanor's chest tightened, the air feeling too thin. Hurt me? She had been sitting here thinking they were finalizing plans, thinking they were on the same page, and Michael had already done it. He'd already crossed that line, made that choice, and kept it from her. The silence between them thickened. She wanted to scream, to throw the flowers in his face, but she couldn't move, couldn't speak. All she could do was stare at him, at the man she thought she knew, and realize she didn't know him at all. Michael, she said quietly, the words cutting through the fog. This wasn't just about the wedding, was it? But Michael didn't answer. He just looked at her, his expression unreadable, his eyes flickering with something she couldn't place. And in that moment, Eleanor realized she wasn't just hurt, she was betrayed. The secret wasn't the wedding. The secret was something much darker. The art gallery smelled like old wood and fresh paint, the air heavy with the scent of creativity and ambition. 10 years ago, Eleanor had watched Vanessa with a kind of maternal pride, the young artist's talent raw, but undeniable. She'd seen the way Vanessa's eyes sparkled when she spoke about color, about light, about the world she was just starting to see through the lens of her own creative vision. Vanessa had been eager, so eager. It had felt natural for Eleanor to take her under her wing, showing her the ropes of the gallery business, introducing her to the right people. Vanessa had quickly become like family to Eleanor, someone she trusted, someone she believed in. And for a while, everything had been perfect. They worked side by side, Eleanor guiding Vanessa through the complicated, competitive world of art curation, offering her insights and advice. Eleanor had been more than a mentor. She had been the kind of support Vanessa needed, believing in her potential long before anyone else did. But then Margot Caldwell entered the picture. It wasn't just that Margot was ruthless in a way Eleanor couldn't quite match. It was the sheer, unapologetic disregard for loyalty that stung the most. Margot had looked Eleanor in the eyes and smiled like an old friend, all while behind closed doors, she was siphoning Eleanor's business concept, her investors, her entire vision. In the blink of an eye, she had taken it all, stolen the very idea that had taken Eleanor years to build. The betrayal had been cold, methodical. Eleanor had lost everything: the gallery, the recognition, the financial backing. She was left with nothing but the remnants of a dream shattered by a woman who didn't care about loyalty, only about what she could take. The only things Eleanor hadn't lost were her home and her son, though, in those early days, it had felt like she had lost those too. The years following the betrayal had been a blur of legal battles, sleepless nights, and the hollow ache of a future rewritten. She would never forget that day, the day Margot's company had announced their new partnership with Vanessa. Eleanor had stood there, watching the world she'd built crumble, and for the first time, she had wondered if family could be a lie. Now, here she was, sitting across from the woman who had once been like a daughter to her, the woman who had taken everything Eleanor had fought for and turned it into a weapon. Vanessa had married Michael, Eleanor's own son. The history between them, the unspoken tension, hung between them like a thick, suffocating fog. The realization struck her hard. This wasn't just a betrayal of business, it was personal. Deeply, gut-wrenchingly personal. Eleanor's hand curled around the glass of champagne she'd been handed, the bubbles fizzing too loudly in her ears. She had come here tonight to congratulate them. Her son, her only child, had just married the daughter of the woman who had destroyed her life. She had to pretend to be happy, pretend to be civil, pretend like she didn't want to tear this moment apart. Congratulations, Eleanor said softly, her voice steady, though the words felt like shards of glass against her tongue. She forced a smile, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, but did its job. She was good at playing this game. She'd had to be. Vanessa's eyes glimmered with that same youthful brightness Eleanor remembered, but there was something colder behind them now. She didn't see a daughter in Vanessa's gaze. She saw a shadow. A shadow of the woman who had taken everything from her. Vanessa reached out, her fingers brushing Eleanor's in a gesture of gratitude, but it felt empty, like a mere formality. "Thank you, Eleanor," Vanessa said, her voice too sweet, too rehearsed. It was a tone Eleanor had come to recognize all too well. That polite tone that meant nothing. But even as she said the words, Eleanor's eyes were already moving, scanning Vanessa as if looking for weaknesses. Her smile tightened as she assessed every inch of the woman before her. The dress, simple, understated, just enough to signal wealth without being ostentatious. The hair, elegant, controlled, like a crown. The way she stood with Michael, just a little too close, as though she was trying to assert some kind of ownership. Eleanor couldn't help herself. She was hunting for any sign that this marriage was as fragile as everything else in her life had been. She had to know. She couldn't let this moment slip by without figuring out where the cracks were, where the lies were buried. As her gaze flicked to Michael, standing a little too quietly at Vanessa's side, something shifted in the air. It wasn't just the tension between her and Vanessa, it was the quiet, unsettling realization that Michael had been a pawn all along. The thought sent a jolt through Eleanor's chest, tightening around her heart. This marriage, this union, what was it really? Was it just a symbol of all the ways she had been manipulated, or was there something deeper at play? Eleanor turned back to Vanessa, her smile faltering only slightly. She had come here tonight to pretend, but maybe, just maybe, this was the moment where she would finally stop pretending. The past had resurfaced, and now it was time to make sure history didn't repeat itself. The kitchen smelled of braised lamb, rich and comforting, the savory scent filling the air as Eleanor set the table for three. The meal was carefully planned, elegant yet restrained. Tonight was meant to feel normal, a calm dinner with her son and his new wife. A return to a familiar ritual that had long ago become a hollow imitation of what it used to be. When the doorbell rang, Eleanor took a deep breath, smoothing her apron down and forcing her face into the polite mask she had perfected over the years. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, but still, the weight of it lingered like a storm on the horizon. Michael's face appeared first, tired but smiling, his arm draped around Vanessa, who wore that practiced, immaculate smile. Her eyes, calm, calculating, locked onto Eleanor's immediately, as if measuring her every move. "Mom," Michael said, stepping inside and pulling her into a quick hug. "It's good to be here." He pulled back, looking at her with that familiar warmth, the one that still reminded her of the little boy she used to know. Vanessa stepped forward, her presence as measured as ever. "Thank you for inviting us," she said, her voice low and smooth, almost purring. There was something off about the way she spoke, too polite, too rehearsed. But Eleanor smiled anyway. "Of course, it's been too long," she said, keeping her tone light. Inside, the dining room gleamed in the soft glow of candlelight, a subtle warmth filling the space. Michael laughed as he took his seat, filling the air with idle chatter. Work stories, nothing of consequence. Eleanor could feel Vanessa's gaze on her, sharp, scanning the room with unsettling precision. It was the same way she'd always looked at things, measuring, calculating, always looking for a way to gain something. The dinner progressed in its quiet, calculated rhythm. Vanessa picked at her food with delicate precision, while Michael rambled on, oblivious to the silent tension that hung in the air like a cloud. As he talked about his day, Vanessa's fingers absent-mindedly traced the rim of her wine glass, her eyes fixed on something far away, something Eleanor couldn't place. "I've been thinking," Vanessa said, her voice smooth but sharp underneath. "Michael and I have been talking about what to do with the old gallery building." She glanced at Eleanor, the corner of her mouth lifting ever so slightly. "We're thinking of turning it into a gallery space again. A bit nostalgic, don't you think?" Eleanor's fork clinked against her plate, a sound that felt like a crack in the atmosphere. She didn't look up right away, but when she did, her eyes met Vanessa's. Cold, unwavering. "Nostalgia," Eleanor said, her voice crisp, almost sharp. "Often smells like blood." Vanessa didn't flinch. Though Eleanor saw a brief flicker in her eyes. The smile didn't falter, but it was tight now, edged. Good, Eleanor thought. Let her feel that. Let her know she wasn't the only one who had been holding on to this. Michael laughed, a little too loudly, trying to fill the silence. "Yeah, I guess. It's crazy how much has changed over the years, huh? Hard to think about it sometimes." Eleanor's eyes were already back on Vanessa. She was watching the woman closely now, every gesture, every movement. But it was her wrist that caught Eleanor's attention, the glint of metal as Vanessa adjusted the cuff of her sleeve. Eleanor's stomach dropped, her heart hammered in her chest. The cufflinks, her husband's cufflinks, the ones that had been locked away in the box with his things, the ones that had been a part of his final estate. They were supposed to stay buried with him, his memory, his legacy. But here they were, on Vanessa's wrist. Eleanor's jaw tightened. The room felt smaller. The air seemed thicker. How could she? Vanessa didn't notice the way Eleanor's gaze had sharpened. She continued to play her part, sipping her wine, playing the role of the perfect wife. But to Eleanor, everything had shifted. This wasn't just a dinner anymore. This was a battlefield. And Vanessa had crossed a line. Eleanor set her glass down with a soft click, her fingers steady. Her mind was already working, already calculating. She wasn't someone who acted impulsively. But tonight, something had changed. Michael was still talking, his voice blending into the background as the adrenaline coursed through Eleanor's veins. She could barely hear him now. The cufflinks gleamed in the dim light, a symbol of everything Vanessa had taken from her, and everything she would take again if Eleanor let her. The silence stretched, Michael's voice floating in and out. But Eleanor was already looking past him, already thinking ahead. She couldn't let this slide. Not now. Not when it had gone this far. This game had just begun, and she would make sure it wasn't Vanessa who walked away with the last word. Eleanor's heels clicked against the marble floors of the law office, the rhythmic sound a stark contrast to the chaos spinning in her mind. Gavin's office was tucked away in an old building on the edge of town, its walls lined with bookshelves, the air thick with the scent of old paper and polished wood. It had been years since she'd seen him face to face. But she knew he would still have the answers she needed. When she stepped inside, Gavin was sitting behind his desk, the low hum of a distant conversation from the hallway filtering in. He was older than she remembered, his hair graying at the temples, but his eyes still held that sharp intelligence that made him indispensable all those years ago. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable, but his gaze unwavering. "Eleanor," he said, standing as she approached. There was no need for pleasantries. The air between them was always straight to the point. "I was expecting you." She nodded, taking a seat across from him, her eyes sharp and calculating. "I need to know what's going on with Vanessa and Margot," she said, her voice steady but cold. "What are they up to?" Gavin leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the desk in a slow, deliberate rhythm. The silence stretched for a moment before he spoke, the words coming with a careful deliberation. They've been quiet. Too quiet, he said. But I've been keeping an eye on their moves. Vanessa and Margot have been quietly purchasing properties, using shell companies to keep everything off the books. Small, unremarkable parcels, at least on the surface. But when you piece it all together, they're circling you again. Eleanor's breath caught, but she didn't let it show. She leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped in front of her, the mask of composure never wavering. "How long have they been doing this?" she asked, her voice low, controlled. "Months," Gavin replied. "They've been laying the groundwork for something bigger. I don't know exactly what. But I can tell you they're positioning themselves, waiting for the right moment." Eleanor's mind raced, the threads of a larger picture beginning to come into focus. She had suspected something, but hearing the confirmation from Gavin made it all the more real. Vanessa and Margot, silent, patient, watching her from the shadows. "They think I'm weak because I've stayed quiet," she said, her eyes narrowing as a faint smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "They've mistaken restraint for surrender." Gavin's gaze softened slightly, but he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He knew Eleanor well enough to understand the fire that burned beneath her calm exterior. She wasn't someone who folded under pressure. She was someone who bided her time, and when the moment came, she would strike. "Let them come closer," she said, her voice hardening. "Let them think I'm vulnerable. They'll make a mistake." Gavin studied her for a long moment, weighing her words. "You're not planning to do anything rash, are you?" Eleanor smiled faintly, her eyes gleaming with a dangerous calm. "I'm not planning to do anything at all," she said, standing. "Not yet. But I'm going to make sure they understand who they're dealing with." She walked toward the door, her steps purposeful. "I'll need you to keep an eye on the properties. I'll start reconnecting with old clients, gathering allies." Gavin rose to his feet, a note of concern creeping into his voice. "Eleanor, be careful. If they're really after you again." Eleanor paused at the door, her fingers brushing the handle. "They're not after me," she said, turning slightly to meet his gaze. "They're after what's mine." As she left the office, the weight of the past few months seemed to lift. She had been quiet for too long. The game was no longer just about survival. It was about reclaiming what was taken from her. Out on the street, Eleanor stood for a moment, feeling the cool evening air on her skin, the city stretching out before her. She had allies to seek, people to reconnect with, old deals to resurrect. Vanessa and Margot might think they had her cornered, but they were wrong. The real fight was just beginning, and this time, Eleanor wouldn't be the one who lost. Eleanor stood by the window, the city below blurred by a faint drizzle, the glass cool against her fingertips. Her mind felt sharper than ever, but the information she had just uncovered gnawed at her, like something dark creeping beneath the surface. Gavin had sent the document to her moments ago, Michael's newly amended will, and everything she'd feared was there in cold, unmistakable ink. The heavy silence in her study felt suffocating. The will, the words, the implications. Vanessa had done it. She had manipulated him, played the role of the adoring wife, all while positioning herself as the primary heir, not just to Michael's estate, but to Eleanor's as well. If Eleanor passed before Michael, everything she had built, everything her late husband had created, would go to Vanessa. Eleanor's breath came slowly, methodically, as she set the paper down on the desk. The weight of it was almost too much to bear. Vanessa was accelerating the same play her mother had run, worming her way into Michael's life, erasing Eleanor from his world, piece by piece. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the desk, her knuckles white. This was more than just betrayal. This was a calculated move to strip her of everything she had worked for. To erase her presence from their lives and rewrite history in Vanessa's favor. There was no more room for hesitation. She had to act. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of the heavy fog that had settled over her. It was Gavin. She answered without looking, her voice cool as ever. "It's done," she said. "Eleanor, are you sure?" Gavin's voice crackled on the other end, concern threading through his words. "I've seen the will," she replied, her tone clipped. "I know what she's done." There was a pause on the line before Gavin spoke again, his voice low, as if weighing his words carefully. "She's been playing this game for months, and now she's made her move. If she gets everything, your holdings, your assets, you'll be out of the picture entirely." Eleanor looked down at the will again, the fine print blurring in front of her eyes. "She's accelerating the same play her mother ran," she muttered. "She thinks she can get away with it. But I'll make sure she doesn't." Gavin's voice softened, but there was a tension there that wasn't in his words before. "So what are you going to do?" Eleanor's smile was faint, her eyes sharp. "I'll finish it before it begins." She ended the call without another word, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the familiar rush of purpose filling her veins. This was war. But it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about making sure Vanessa never crossed this line again. Later that evening, Eleanor was alone in her study again, the night deep and quiet around her. She pulled out her old, worn leather binder, her will, the one that had kept her holdings in her family's name for decades, a document that had once felt unbreakable. But now, it wasn't enough. She wouldn't leave anything to chance, not to Michael, not to Vanessa, not to anyone who thought they could control her legacy. With a steady hand, she updated the will, her fingers flying across the pages as she disinherited Michael entirely. She wouldn't let him have a single penny if she passed. Not a single asset. He had become too entangled in Vanessa's web, and there was no place for him in her world anymore. Instead, she reallocated everything, her wealth, her estate, to a foundation in her late husband's name, a foundation that would carry on his legacy, that would keep their memory alive, untainted by the greed of those who would try to erase it. When she was done, Eleanor set the pen down, her hand trembling for the briefest moment. She had done what needed to be done. Vanessa might think she was on the brink of victory, but Eleanor had just altered the course of the game. The board was set now. As Eleanor stood, she glanced at the document one last time. The weight of her decision hung heavy in the room, but she felt no regret. This was what needed to happen. This was the end of Vanessa's game, not the beginning. And as she sealed the envelope with a quick snap, she knew she was ready for the fight to come. But there was one more thing. She had to make sure the will was delivered, before Vanessa could make her next move. The game had changed. And this time, it was Eleanor who held the power. The grand ballroom shimmered under chandeliers that dripped like jewels, casting a soft glow over the sea of tuxedos and glittering gowns. The Charleston Gala was a celebration of old money, new power, and the art of social survival. Vanessa, standing near the entrance, had already positioned herself at the center of it all. Her gown, a flawless creation of silk and satin, clung to her like a second skin, accentuating every curve. She wore her new status like a crown, as if she had always belonged here, like she was born for this moment. Her laugh rang out, clear and confident, cutting through the low murmur of conversation. She exchanged pleasantries with a group of influential art collectors, her voice smooth, practiced, her every movement calculated for effect. She was untouchable, a queen in her own right. And Eleanor was nowhere near her league, but Eleanor was there, in the far corner of the room, standing with her back straight, her posture regal as always. She watched. Her eyes cut through the crowd, a calm, measured gaze. She moved like she had all the time in the world, the slight sway of her dress trailing behind her like a shadow, a presence too sharp to ignore. Vanessa finally spotted her, and for a moment, their gazes locked across the room. The tension between them was palpable, a magnetism that pulled the air taut. Vanessa's lips curled upward, a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Eleanor," Vanessa said as she glided over, her voice dripping with insincerity. "How lovely of you to join us. I've heard you're, well, still lingering in the past? It must be hard to let go of that old gallery era." The words were a jab, sharp and public, meant to wound. And Vanessa knew exactly where to strike. At the legacy Eleanor had worked her entire life to build. The old gallery had been Eleanor's pride, a monument to her taste, her vision. But in Vanessa's eyes, it was something to be torn down and replaced with her own image of what the world should see. A world that no longer had space for Eleanor's past. Eleanor didn't flinch. She was still. Her smile remained, a mask of grace. She took a step closer, her eyes never leaving Vanessa's. "Some eras end," Eleanor said softly, the words dripping with venom. "Some people just rot." There it was, the subtle power shift, the quiet power play. Vanessa's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but only those watching closely would have caught it. It wasn't a response anyone expected from Eleanor, who had spent so much time being the quiet, controlled figure. But this was different. Eleanor wasn't just the widow anymore. She was a force. A woman who had seen too much to let the likes of Vanessa intimidate her. The room seemed to freeze for a brief heartbeat. The art collectors shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other, the tension palpable. But before the conversation could turn, Gavin slipped into the space between them. He was still dressed in his usual understated style, sharp suit, tie loose enough to show he wasn't exactly playing by the rules of the gala. His eyes flicked to Eleanor's, unreadable, before he subtly passed her an envelope, his fingers brushing hers. Eleanor's gaze flickered down for a brief moment before she tucked the envelope into her clutch, not breaking her composure for a second. She didn't need to open it now. She could already feel the weight of the document inside, the property transfers, the things Vanessa and Margot thought they had locked down, things Eleanor had been quietly unraveling for weeks. Vanessa, blissfully unaware of the shifting tides beneath her feet, continued to smirk, clearly relishing the victory she thought was hers. She didn't know yet that her empire was built on sand, that every gleaming piece of property she had quietly accumulated was about to be swept out from under her. All it would take was one quiet stroke of a pen, a few more shifts in the right places, and everything would change. Margot, standing at the far end of the ballroom, watched the exchange between Eleanor and Vanessa, her expression unreadable. She had always been the watcher, the one who stood on the periphery, calculating the next move. Eleanor had never forgotten Margot's silent, lingering gaze at the edge of every confrontation. But now, Margot's attention was more than just observation. It was a reminder of history, a history Eleanor knew well. The quiet players were often the most dangerous, the ones who knew how to wait, how to strike when the time was right. Eleanor let her eyes drift back to Vanessa. "I think," she said with a small smile, "you're mistaken. This gala is not your victory. Not yet." Vanessa's smile faltered again, this time just enough for Eleanor to see the crack. The room buzzed around them, a hum of chatter and clinking glasses, but inside it was a battlefield, and Eleanor was laying the groundwork for the next phase of the fight. She glanced down at the envelope in her clutch once more, a silent promise to herself. She would be the one to finish this. Not with grand gestures, not with empty threats, but with the kind of quiet, lethal precision only a woman like her could manage. The game was on, and this time, the prize wouldn't be Vanessa's to take. The evening had the kind of quiet that only came with a well-calibrated performance. Everything polished, everything in its place. Eleanor had invited them back, the couple that had made a habit of testing her limits. Dinner was meant to be an exercise in civility, but beneath the surface, it was anything but. The table was set simply, a sharp contrast to the ostentation of the gala. Elegant, understated, but still exuding wealth. Crystal glasses reflected the flickering candlelight, and the deep red of the wine seemed almost too perfect, the kind that made everything taste sharper, feel sharper. Eleanor watched as Vanessa and Michael settled into their chairs, their movements choreographed by years of habit and luxury. Wine? Eleanor's voice was soft, inviting, but there was a certain coolness to it that made the question feel more like a challenge than a gesture of hospitality. She poured with deliberate care, watching the liquid swirl in the glass. Vanessa smiled politely, the same smile she had worn at the gala, that practiced, glittering smile. "You're too kind," she said, accepting the glass, but her eyes flitted nervously for a brief moment. She had always hated feeling like she was being watched, studied. Eleanor didn't take her seat yet. Instead, she stood at the head of the table, a silent command over the room. Her eyes moved from Vanessa to Michael and back again, like a chess master calculating the next move. "I do hope you're both enjoying yourselves," Eleanor said, her voice warm but with an edge, as though the words had been measured and weighed in advance. Michael smiled a little too quickly, as if trying to prove something, anything. "We're fine. Really, it's been good to see you again. We don't get enough time together, do we?" Vanessa nodded, but there was a stiffness to her demeanor. The fine wine they were sipping should have made them more relaxed, but instead, it seemed to thicken the air, sharpening the conversation until it felt like shards of glass were rattling in the silence between each word. The tension was palpable, the kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful, but suffocating. And Eleanor, standing just slightly out of reach, with that razor-sharp composure of hers, was all too aware of it. Vanessa's voice cut through the stillness. "Maybe you can finally relax, Eleanor," she said, her words dripping with honeyed sweetness, but the underlying meaning was clear. "We'll take care of things from here." Eleanor's lips curled into a smile that didn't touch her eyes. She didn't move to sit. She didn't need to. "Yes," she said softly. "You've always been so hands-on." The words hung in the air, weighted with a meaning that only the two women understood. Vanessa's facade cracked, just for a second, before she could mask it again, guilt flickering behind her perfectly composed face. It was there, just a glimpse. Something raw that she hadn't intended. Eleanor saw it, and her smile tightened, but she said nothing more. Michael, ever the peacemaker, cleared his throat, his voice softer than it had been at the gala. "Mom, please, why can't you just accept her? You're making this harder than it needs to be." Eleanor's gaze shifted to her son. His words, meant to disarm, were the kind of blunt instrument only someone who truly believed in their cause would use. But Eleanor wasn't easily swayed. She took a long, deliberate sip of wine, her hand steady as she set the glass back down. "Accept her?" Eleanor's voice was low, almost too calm. "You want me to accept someone who's been playing a game from the start? Someone who's maneuvered herself into every corner of our lives, including yours?" She fixed her gaze on Michael, the intensity of it enough to make him flinch, even if just slightly. "I recognize predators when I see them, Michael. And you, my dear, are too blind to see what's right in front of you." The words landed like a punch. Michael recoiled, his mouth opening, but no words came out. The silence that followed was more brutal than any argument they had ever had. Vanessa, sensing the change in the mood, shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her glass forgotten for a moment. Eleanor's voice softened, but the bite was still there. I'm not asking you to agree with me, but I'm done pretending. Michael stood up abruptly, the chair scraping across the floor. You don't get it. You never have. It's always been about you. Can't you just let me have something for once? Eleanor didn't flinch. I've let you have everything, Michael, she said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. But you don't understand the stakes. And I'm not going to sit idly by while you're being taken in. Michael's eyes darkened, and for the first time in years, Eleanor saw the shadow of his anger flare up, that volatile mix of frustration and disbelief that he had been harboring for far too long. He shook his head, the tension thick between them. I can't do this anymore, Mom. I won't. He turned abruptly, walking toward the door, the sharp sound of his footsteps echoing in the otherwise quiet room. Eleanor didn't move, didn't even blink, as she watched her son walk away. The weight of the conversation hung heavy in the air, and for a long moment, the only sound was the soft clink of the wine glasses as Vanessa set hers down too, her smile faltering just enough to show the cracks beneath. Eleanor finally sat down, but she did not look at Vanessa. She was already miles ahead, calculating the next move, feeling the sharp sting of the battle that had just begun. Vanessa, her lips parted, stared at Eleanor, but neither of them spoke. The game had changed, and now they were playing for keeps. The soft hum of the city outside Eleanor's window was a stark contrast to the weight of the information Gavin had just shared with her. The lines of the phone call still echoed in her mind. Vanessa and Margot's companies are under quiet SEC review, Gavin's voice had said, calm yet weighted. No one knows yet, but things are tightening around them. They're starting to get attention. Eleanor stood motionless by the window, her eyes not truly seeing the blur of city lights stretching below. The news was a game changer, another piece of the puzzle that threatened to collapse the entire house of cards Vanessa had built. Eleanor had expected this day to come, but hearing it from Gavin felt like a breath held for too long, finally exhaled. Without missing a beat, she reached for her desk drawer and pulled out a stack of neatly filed papers, one of which had her name written in sharp ink across the top. A thin, delicate thread of a plan she'd been weaving in silence. She scribbled a quick note to Detective Renee, an old contact who knew how to operate in the shadows, far from the reach of Vanessa's manipulations. She'd been careful, very careful, to disguise it as a concerned citizen tip. A vague lead on a potential financial scandal involving Vanessa's and Margot's interests. Nothing concrete, just enough to stir the pot. Eleanor knew that Renee would know exactly how to follow it, how to draw the lines between money trails and dirty hands. The phone call with Gavin had ended without fanfare. She didn't need to say much. She never did. But there was one thing that gnawed at her, the growing sensation that Vanessa and Margot had underestimated just how far Eleanor was willing to go. They thought they were the ones in control, but that control was slipping, thread by thread. Later that evening, Eleanor found herself in a darker part of the city, an office building that had once been a grand display of opulence, but now felt like a relic, fading into obsolescence. She sat in the small, dimly lit room across from Renee, who was going over the first set of documents Eleanor had supplied. The detective's fingers traced the edges of the report, the same way someone might test the sharpness of a blade. You did good, Renee said, her voice low, but there was a spark of something in her eyes that made Eleanor trust her, an almost predatory glint that matched her own. They're sloppy. If these accounts are real, I'll make sure the SEC sees them. It'll be hard for them to cover it up when someone's paying attention. Eleanor's lips curved into a faint smile. That's why I'm trusting you. As the conversation drifted into specifics, financial transfers, offshore accounts, everything Eleanor needed to push Vanessa and Margot into the spotlight, she didn't notice how the weight of the plan had already begun to shift the atmosphere in the city outside. The quiet tension, the feeling of something about to snap, was creeping into the lives of those who thought they were untouchable. Vanessa, meanwhile, was beginning to feel it. The change in the air, the tightening of her grip. She could sense the pressure, the way her empire seemed to be slipping out from under her. Meetings that had once been routine now felt laden with risk. Calls that had been made with a casual ease now felt like ticking time bombs. She didn't know what was happening, only that something was. She could see it in the eyes of her colleagues, her staff. They were looking at her differently, and she hated it. By the time the evening came, Vanessa found herself pacing in her penthouse, her fingers trembling around the edge of a glass of wine. "I don't understand," she muttered to herself, staring out over the city. Her reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't her own face she saw. It was Eleanor's. Eleanor, who was always one step ahead. Michael came in, his movements stiff, his brow furrowed in that way that meant he was holding something back. "Vanessa," he said, his voice tight. "What's going on? You're unraveling. Everything's falling apart." She looked at him sharply, her pulse quickening, a mix of anger and fear rising in her chest. "I'm fine," she snapped. But the words didn't sound convincing, even to her. "Just a little stress. It'll pass. I'm dealing with it." "Dealing with it?" Michael's voice rose. "You're not dealing with anything, you're burying it. All I ever see is you controlling everything and everyone. You're making this harder than it needs to be." The accusation hit like a jolt. Michael's face, his betrayal, it was too much for her to ignore. Vanessa's eyes narrowed, the walls inside her mind coming up in a rush. "What is your problem?" she demanded. "You're the one who's always been too weak to see what's right in front of you." "I'm not weak," Michael retorted. I'm tired. I can't keep pretending everything's fine." He turned to leave, his face set, but as he reached the door, he turned back. "You're ruining my marriage," he said, his voice shaking with a mix of frustration and sadness. Vanessa stared after him, her heart thundering in her chest. His words, piercing, undeniable, landed hard. "You're ruining my marriage." She knew, deep down, that it wasn't just Michael. It was everything she had built, everything she thought was solid. And suddenly, as she stood there in the quiet, something snapped inside her. Eleanor's words so long ago echoed in her mind. No, Eleanor had whispered at the dinner table that night. She already did. Vanessa felt a cold shiver creep down her spine as she stared at her reflection, the cracks widening. The game was almost over. The email hit like an icicle to the heart. Balance change alert, trust fund account. Withdrawal processed, $5,000. Eleanor stared at the screen until the numbers blurred, refusing to accept the arithmetic of betrayal. She opened the transaction history. The withdrawal was recent, the beneficiary, Vanessa's law firm. The initiating signature, Michael. Her knees wanted to give. Instead, she gripped the edge of her desk until her knuckles whitened. The trust fund had been the last tangible tether to her husband's name, a careful, stubborn inheritance she'd kept intact, so their son would never have to choose between survival and sentiment. Now half of it was seeping into an attorney's escrow account, labeled legal fees. Grief arrived first, sharp and animal. It was a hollowing that lived under anger, the kind of grief that doesn't roar, but quietly tears a person open. Eleanor had hated the idea of crying. It felt like surrender. And yet, for the first time in years, tears slid down her face, and she did not wipe them away immediately. They were small, private indictments of something she had trusted to be immovable. She dialed Michael before she could think better of it. "Where is it?" she asked when he answered. Her voice was quiet, every syllable measured. "Where did our money go?" There was a stumbling on the other end. "Vanessa, she needs it for her legal team. There are threats, Mom. I can't let her—" You drained your father's legacy, Eleanor said, and the words were brittle as glass. You emptied what was meant to preserve him, to preserve us. You did it to protect her lies. Silence. Then, I'm doing what I think is right. No, she whispered. You're doing what she convinced you was right. You've let yourself be used. The call ended with a mutual silence that felt like finality. Eleanor did not feel anger's cinematic heat. Instead, she felt a cold, precise clarity. Betrayal had carved a new landscape. She needed to learn its contours. She rang Gavin. Her voice was cooler now, businesslike. I need time. Keep everything moving. Don't let them see me stumble. She didn't say she needed to vanish. Gavin asked the question she expected. Eleanor, retreat or retaliate? Both, she said. Let them think I am broken. Give them the comfort of victory. She left the city without ceremony. For a week, she did not answer calls. She walked, sat in cheap hotels with heavy curtains, wrote and rewrote a plan that had to be precise, down to the last legal footnote. The vacancy of those days thinned grief into a tool, a sharpened edge she could use rather than be cut by. When she returned, something in her had been altered. The rawness was gone. In its place, cold architecture. She spent an hour with Gavin, laying out moves like a chess player aligning pieces, foundations, transfers, legal contingencies. He watched her, old worry in his eyes. They think I've lost, she said, and there was no plea in it. It was a statement of intent. Let's show them how wrong they are. Outside, in the streetlight, her shadow cut a long, precise shape across the pavement. Inside, the documents were being prepared. Somewhere between grief and fury, Eleanor had gone from a woman betrayed to a strategist ready for war. And Michael, who had taken their past to protect a present built on falsehood, would be the first to see how costly loyalty could become. The quiet hum of the offshore wire transfer was almost imperceptible, but to Eleanor it sounded like the sound of chains loosening, a rattling she could feel all the way down to her bones. She sat at the desk in her dimly lit office, the late afternoon sun fading behind the skyline, casting long shadows over the room. The deal was already done. Through Gavin's untraceable channels, she had bought Margot's debt. Every single dollar of it. With precise calculation, Eleanor had moved pieces on the financial board, and the weight of it hit her with an almost visceral satisfaction. Margot's empire, built on smoke and mirrors, on the backs of others, had become her new target. The news came through at 6 p.m. A package of foreclosure notices, 7 of them, each stamped with the cold finality of loss, were delivered to Margot's penthouse. Her financial house of cards, delicately constructed over years of deals and double dealings, collapsed in a matter of hours. Banks would want payment, creditors would call, and the shadows of her past, long buried under luxury and pretense, would resurface. Margot would never see it coming, and she would never be able to outrun it. At 7 p.m., Vanessa called. Her voice was tightly wound, clipped. "What did you do?" she demanded, as if the air itself had thickened with her panic. Eleanor could hear the fear, raw and exposed, creeping into her tone. The sound was like a sweet melody to Eleanor's ears. "Your accounts are linked. I know you're responsible for Margot's debts. And now," she paused for effect. "Now, we see what happens when things fall apart." The phone went dead in Eleanor's hand before Vanessa could respond. In the quiet that followed, Eleanor watched the night unfold outside her window. The city was still, holding its breath, waiting. Vanessa's panic had been swift. Too swift. The realization had settled into her like a chill. The ground beneath her was eroding. The cracks in her empire had become too wide to ignore. Eleanor could almost see her, rushing between calls, her grip tightening around the last remaining shreds of control. And she thought of Michael. Somewhere in the distance, he must be trying to steady the chaos, trying to convince himself that he wasn't caught between two worlds, his mother's legacy and his wife's unraveling lies. Just then, her phone buzzed. Detective Renee's number flashed on the screen. Eleanor answered, her voice steady, almost rehearsed. "You were right," Renee said, her voice like a blade sheathed in velvet. "We're filing charges. We've got enough to move forward. The SEC's been notified." Eleanor didn't flinch. "I know," she replied quietly, her gaze shifting out the window. A soft exhale, another breath, another win. She hung up the phone without another word, then paused. She tapped her fingers lightly against the screen of her phone, contemplating. She had one message to send, one thing she needed to make perfectly clear. She found Michael's name in her contacts. The screen glowed back at her, waiting. "Your wife's legacy looks a lot like mine used to." She hit send. The silence that followed was suffocating. For a brief moment, it seemed like time had slowed. The message, simple yet devastating, would reach him soon. There would be no coming back from this. The floodgates had opened. The devastation that Vanessa had carefully constructed was already falling apart, piece by piece. And Michael, so certain of the righteousness of his choices, would now see the full weight of what had been done. Eleanor sat back in her chair, a small, satisfied smile tugging at the corners of her lips. They thought they were playing a game. But this was war, and war was never fair. The minutes stretched as Eleanor waited for Michael's response, knowing, with cold certainty, that no matter what he said, he would never look at her, or his life, the same way again. But no reply came. Not yet. And in the silence, Eleanor finally felt the truth settle in. It was over. The knock on the door was the sound of finality. Eleanor knew what it meant before the pounding reached her ears. It was too precise, too heavy, too certain. She sat in her office, a single lamp casting long shadows across her desk. The calm before the storm was almost unbearable. She could feel the city humming outside her window, unaware of the fury that was about to unfold. Federal agents flooded Margot's firm just before dawn. The plan had been set in motion weeks ago, a quiet escalation. Renee had kept her word. 2 months of covert surveillance, financial analysis, and quietly gathering dirt had led to this moment. In the span of an hour, every door to Margot's operations had been slammed shut. Computers seized, files boxed, accounts frozen. The scope of the collapse was swift and merciless, but it wasn't over yet. Vanessa had expected Margot's fall to be messy, but she hadn't prepared for the aftermath. Word traveled fast in their circle, but by the time Vanessa had gathered her thoughts, the damage was already done. It took mere moments for the first agent to knock on her penthouse door. A dozen more followed, and the web she had spent years constructing began to unravel. She didn't even have time to pack a bag. She bolted. The penthouse, a testament to her control over the last decade, felt like a prison in that moment. Her heart hammered in her chest as she grabbed her phone, calling everyone she knew, only to find their voices muted, distant. Her options were evaporating. There was no one left to protect her. In the early morning stillness, she slipped out the back door and into the alley. The cold air bit at her skin as she disappeared into the shadows. The city was vast, but not vast enough. Not anymore. Detective Renee's team was already on her trail. "Track her," Renee ordered to her unit as they monitored the data streams. "She's moving fast, but we'll catch her." Vanessa's phone buzzed with a message just as she rounded a corner, weaving through a maze of back streets. She didn't dare look at it. The sound of sirens in the distance was growing louder, echoing off the buildings like the slow tightening of a noose. Renee's team pinpointed her location within seconds. The dance was over. By the time Michael arrived, it was too late. He'd been waiting at home, hoping against all reason that the storm would pass, that the world he'd built alongside Vanessa could somehow survive. He arrived at the scene to find his wife, hands cuffed, surrounded by agents, her face pale and streaked with fear. The bright lights of the street lamps glared in his eyes, too harsh for the delicate state of things. His voice caught in his throat as he stepped out of the car and into the reality of his new world. "Vanessa," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. She didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed straight ahead, her expression one of cold, brittle resolve. He couldn't read her. Not now. A uniformed officer pushed him back as they led her toward the squad car. Michael reached out, helpless. "Mom, what did you do?" His voice cracked with disbelief, confusion, and something deeper, grief. The weight of it was like a physical blow. Eleanor stood across the street, her figure framed by the shadows. She'd been watching, a ghost in the periphery. She said nothing as Michael's words cut through the air. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she observed the scene unfold. For the first time, she saw her son. Not the child she'd raised, not the confused young man in front of her, but something else, something colder. A man, broken in a way he hadn't been before. She exhaled slowly, her lips curving into a faint smile as she crossed the street. "Nothing you didn't start," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Michael froze. It was like he'd been slapped. Her words carried a weight he'd never anticipated, never wanted to understand until now. There was no denying it. The ruthlessness he'd witnessed in Vanessa, how easily she'd pushed others aside, crushed anyone who threatened her. He'd inherited that legacy. All this time, he'd thought he'd been caught in the wake of his mother's fragile world. But now he saw the truth. Eleanor wasn't frail. She wasn't a victim. She was a force. She stepped closer, her gaze cold. "Now you know where your ruthlessness comes from." Michael swallowed hard, the weight of her words crushing him. He didn't look at his mother. He couldn't. Not with the truth sinking into his gut like broken glass. He looked at Vanessa, who was being pushed into the car, and for the first time, he realized something. The world he thought he could control, everything he thought he knew, was nothing but a facade. He wasn't in charge anymore, and his mother was the one who had built it. As the door slammed behind Vanessa and the engine roared to life, Eleanor turned on her heel. For a moment, there was nothing left but the sound of the wind and the distant echoes of sirens, and Michael, standing alone. The courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation, the air thick with tension and the murmur of reporters vying for position. Eleanor sat near the back, her posture stiff, her gaze fixed on the proceedings. She had never been a fan of the public spectacle, but this time it was different. Vanessa was sitting at the defendant's table, hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her once immaculate appearance now seemed disheveled under the harsh glare of the courtroom lights. The lines around her eyes were drawn tight, her lips a thin, unforgiving line. Eleanor could see the panic simmering just beneath the surface. The quiet desperation of someone whose world was crumbling and who no longer had the means to fight back. The charges were brutal: fraud, identity manipulation, and conspiracy to defraud investors. The scope of Vanessa's crimes, once carefully hidden behind a glossy facade of power and wealth, had been revealed in excruciating detail. Every twist, every lie, every transaction, laid bare for the public to see. Margot had refused the plea deal. She was throwing all the blame onto Vanessa. It wasn't hard to see why. In the end, Margot had positioned herself far enough from the epicenter of the mess to avoid taking the fall herself. But Vanessa was the one who'd set the fire. Now, Margot would stand in the witness box and, with an icy stare, would testify against her daughter-in-law, pinning every act of deception and manipulation directly on Vanessa's shoulders. Why didn't you take the deal? Eleanor whispered to herself, her voice nearly drowned out by the low hum of the crowd. The answer was simple. Vanessa was stubborn. She would never admit to being wrong, not even now, when the weight of her choices was crashing down on her. Even in this room, with everything at risk, she clung to the notion that she could win. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The trial began, but Eleanor's mind wasn't fully in the room. Instead, she felt the familiar churn in her stomach, the turmoil she hadn't been able to shake since Michael had been swept into this storm. Her son was missing from this courtroom, a casualty of his own choices, a casualty of Vanessa's ambition. The lawyers spoke with precision, each one trying to shape the narrative to make the case clearer. Eleanor's gaze never wavered from Vanessa, who, despite her outward calm, could not conceal the tremor in her hands. It wasn't until the cross-examination began that the true nature of Vanessa's unraveling came into full view. Her lawyer had done what they could to keep her from breaking down, but in the face of Margot's testimony, Vanessa's resolve shattered. As her mother-in-law recounted the web of lies Vanessa had spun, how she had manipulated Michael, the way she'd used him as a pawn, it was clear. Vanessa wasn't going to win this one. The tension in the room reached a breaking point when Vanessa finally turned to Eleanor. Her eyes, wild with a mixture of defiance and fear, locked onto her mother-in-law's gaze. In that moment, everything paused. "You'll never get your son back," Vanessa hissed, her voice cold and venomous. The words struck like a slap, but Eleanor didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned forward, her expression hardening. Her voice was measured, controlled, even as her heart twisted inside her chest. "I already buried him," Eleanor replied, her words slow and deliberate, cutting through the air like a knife. The words felt final. There would be no going back. Michael's allegiance, his loyalties, were beyond repair. He was lost, tangled in Vanessa's lies, just as she had once been. The reporters in the back stirred, their pens scratching furiously against notepads. Eleanor felt their eyes, but she didn't care. She wasn't here for them. She was here for herself, for Michael, and for the years she'd spent rebuilding what had been taken from her. Outside the courthouse, the media storm had already begun. The cameras clicked and flashed, capturing the once glamorous life of the Charleston power couple being dragged into the light. "Charleston power couple exposed," the headlines would read. The empire they had built, the world they'd created. It was all crumbling. Vanessa's face would be splashed across every tabloid, and the public would forget her name in the blink of an eye, just as easily as they had embraced it. But for Eleanor, the weight of it was different. The world was no longer watching her every move. The world was watching Vanessa. The public spectacle had always been her burden to bear. But now, the burden had shifted. As she walked out into the daylight, the sun warm against her skin, she finally felt something she hadn't realized she'd been waiting for. Relief. It wasn't complete, but it was enough. Enough to know that she had done what needed to be done. Enough to know that, after everything, she was still standing. For the first time in years, Eleanor allowed herself to breathe. The weight was lifting, and no matter what came next, she knew one thing for certain. The game was over, and she had won. The sun had long dipped below the horizon when Gavin's call came through. Eleanor was still at her desk, eyes trained on the darkening city outside her window. The aftermath of the trial lingered in the pit of her stomach like a heavy stone. It was done. Vanessa was on her way to a long sentence, her empire dismantled, but the feeling of finality was elusive. It had never been about the victory itself, but about what was left in its wake. She answered the phone with the practiced calm that had become second nature to her, though she knew instinctively that something had shifted. Gavin didn't call unless it was important. "Eleanor, you might want to sit down," he said, his voice unusually tight. Her pulse quickened. "What is it?" "It's about your foundation," he said, and Eleanor's heart stilled. "Gavin, I told you I don't want any more surprises. I've got enough on my plate." "It's not what you think." He hesitated. "There's a clause. A hidden clause, deep in the fine print." She was silent for a long beat, processing. "The assets in your foundation," he continued, "all of them, they revert to Michael. If he reconciles with you, publicly, and apologizes, honestly." Eleanor's breath caught. "What the hell are you talking about?" "I'm saying your revenge, all of it, was designed with a path to redemption," Gavin replied. "You made sure that if Michael came back, really came back, the Foundation's assets would be his again, but only if he admitted everything and apologized. You gave him a chance." The weight of his words hit her in waves. She had planned for this. Of course she had. She had set up the perfect trap, and Michael had walked into it, blind to the way it would unfold. But the part that made her stomach twist now was that, deep down, she had always wanted him to come back. She wanted him to see what he had done, to admit it, and then perhaps to be the man she had always hoped he would be. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sharp tone of her phone vibrating on the desk. A call from Detective Renee. She picked it up quickly, already knowing what the news would be. "He came in voluntarily," Renee said, her voice crisp. "Michael, he came in. He confessed everything, Eleanor. He's clearing your name." Eleanor blinked, her chest tightening as her pulse quickened. "Michael?" she asked, almost as though she couldn't believe it. "Yeah. He said he was wrong. Said he didn't listen to you, that he was blind to the truth. He's taking full responsibility for everything." A tremor passed through her. She hadn't expected this. Not in the way it was happening, not in the way it was unfolding before her eyes. "Eleanor, he's at the station. He's ready to testify." Renee's voice softened, as though recognizing the gravity of the moment. "You'll be vindicated." Her hands trembled, and she found herself unable to speak for a few moments. All of it, the chaos, the destruction, was coming to a head. But it was not going to be like she had imagined. No grand apology, no sweeping redemption. Instead, Michael was taking responsibility for his choices, for his failures, and for the devastation that had broken them both. In the quiet of her office, Eleanor thought of Michael, of the boy she had raised, of the man he had become. She had spent so many years imagining this moment, but now, standing on the edge of it, she wasn't sure if she should feel relief or sorrow. "Tell him I'm not coming," she finally said, her voice rough with the unexpected emotion. "You're sure?" Renee asked. There was hesitation in her voice. Eleanor closed her eyes, leaning back in her chair. "I'm sure." She hadn't known what would happen when she set this chain in motion. She hadn't known that the reckoning she sought would also be a form of redemption. But in that moment, as she thought of Michael standing before a judge, owning his mistakes and clearing her name, she felt something break loose inside her. A weight. But not the weight she'd been carrying all these years. A different kind. The kind that came with the realization that some things, no matter how much they hurt, were finally irrevocably over. Minutes passed in a slow, unbearable stretch. Eleanor watched her reflection in the window, her face drawn, her eyes weary. But there was something different now, something softer in her gaze. The phone clicked off, and she sat in the silence, waiting for the world to catch up to her. Outside, the city stretched before her, cold and vast. But now, with everything that had happened, everything that had been broken and rebuilt, she wasn't afraid of it. Not anymore. And she didn't need Michael to tell her he was sorry. She had already buried that boy. The man he had become, this new version, the one who had confessed the truth, was his own, not hers. Closure, faint but steady, began to settle over her like the cool breath of dawn. And then, in the distance, a car door slammed. The sound echoed through the empty streets. She didn't need to look. She knew the end was already written. It was over. For both of them. Eleanor stood in the center of the small gallery, the pale sunlight of late afternoon spilling through wide windows and casting long shadows across the floor. The space was modest, nothing like the imposing marble-lined showroom she had once run. It was quiet and clean, with bare walls ready to be filled with stories. The wooden floors were freshly polished, and everything smelled faintly of paint and new beginnings. She ran her hand along the edge of the counter, feeling the coolness of the stone beneath her fingers. This was her life now. Small, but hers. The old gallery, the high-rise, the vast gleaming empire, it was all gone. Stripped away in the wake of Vanessa's betrayal and Michael's silence. But this place, felt right. It was where the remnants of her past could be quietly reassembled, piece by fragile piece. The door chimed softly as Gavin entered, his presence a familiar comfort and a subtle reminder of the chaos she had left behind. He was dressed as always, too polished, too sharp for a quiet afternoon like this, but his gaze softened as it took in the space. "Peace suits you," he said, his voice low, not quite a question, but a quiet observation. Eleanor didn't smile, but there was a brief flicker of something in her eyes, something close to contentment. "It cost enough," she replied, her tone steady but carrying the weight of all that had been lost. Gavin stepped further into the room, his gaze scanning the walls, the art displayed in understated frames, mostly abstract fractured pieces that spoke of destruction and renewal. "I didn't think you'd come back to this," he said. "The art, the gallery." "I didn't think I would either," Eleanor admitted, folding her arms, her fingers tapping lightly against the soft fabric of her blouse. "But I had to. For me." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken words, the kind of silence that marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Eleanor's eyes lingered on the art, but she wasn't really seeing it. She was thinking of the price, the years of manipulation, the lies, the betrayals. How Michael had never come back, not until everything had been torn apart. How she had almost lost herself in the process. But now, this. A quiet place. A place where she could simply breathe. Gavin reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, his fingers lingering on the edge before he handed it to her. "From Michael," he said, a note of hesitation in his voice. Eleanor froze for just a moment, the words she had longed to hear dancing at the edge of her thoughts, the hope she had buried deep within her chest coming back to the surface. She took the envelope, turned it over in her hands. His handwriting. "I'm sorry. It was simple. Too simple, maybe." The apology she had waited for. But in the end, it felt like too little. Too late. She didn't open it fully. Instead, she folded it carefully, placed it beneath a framed portrait of her late husband, whose smiling face seemed to watch over her, unchanged, unaffected by the chaos of the world she had navigated. The letter would stay there. It was as much for her as it was for him. "I thought I wanted this," she whispered to herself, mostly to the stillness of the room. Gavin, ever the perceptive one, said nothing. He understood. He had always understood. Outside, the world still moved. News vans, flashing cameras, and the distant murmur of public life. But Eleanor was no longer part of that. Her empire had crumbled, and with it, she had rebuilt something smaller, quieter, and more true to herself. Vanessa had been sentenced. Margot was bankrupt. The world had watched, and now it had moved on. For Eleanor, the story was ending, but in this small sunlit gallery, a new beginning had taken root. The door opened again, a fresh breeze sweeping through. Eleanor smiled to herself for the first time in what felt like years, knowing that though the scars of the past would never fully fade, she could finally start to let go. And that, for now, was enough. The evening in Charleston was soft, the streets still wet from a recent rainstorm. Eleanor stood in the middle of her gallery, the last of the light from the street lamps bleeding through the wide windows, making the polished floors gleam like wet stone. The scent of the rain hung in the air, mingling with the faint traces of paint, old wood, and something older still, a quiet sense of closure that had taken years to come. She wiped a bead of moisture from the counter and slid her hand across the smooth, cold surface. Everything had a newness to it now, even the dim light that flickered against the windows like an old memory. The door clicked softly behind her as she locked it for the night. She took one last look at the room, this small, modest place she had slowly built from the remnants of everything she'd lost, and then stepped out into the night. The city was calm, the rain having cleansed the streets of their usual rush. There was a stillness in the air, as if Charleston itself had taken a collective breath, a moment of reprieve after the storms that had passed through both the city and her life. The rain reflected the city lights like spilled champagne, dancing along the sidewalk in golden streaks. It was beautiful in its own quiet way, much like the life she was beginning to carve out for herself. She walked with purpose, her footsteps echoing softly on the wet pavement. The sound of her heels was the only noise, but she wasn't alone. Gavin had come up behind her, keeping a careful distance, not quite intruding but close enough to be there when she needed him. The man who had always been her rock, the one who understood the cost of the choices she had made. He caught up to her slowly, his voice a low murmur in the quiet of the street. "Worth it?" he asked, his tone laced with something like curiosity, but also resignation. He knew the toll it had taken, had seen her through it all. Eleanor didn't break her stride. She didn't need to think about it. The answer was already inside her, worn into the fabric of who she was now. She glanced down at the ring on her left hand, the one she had never expected to wear again. It wasn't hers to begin with. It had belonged to Vanessa, that garish piece of luxury she had flaunted at their wedding, an emblem of everything Eleanor had lost. Now it was hers, repossessed, reclaimed, and it felt strange, like a cruel joke played at the cost of years of betrayal, but Eleanor didn't regret it. Not now. Not anymore. "Every second," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. As she walked on, the camera lingered on her hand, the once beautiful diamond ring catching the streetlight, a sharp contrast against the softness of the rain-soaked night. The ring that had symbolized a marriage built on lies and manipulation. The ring that now belonged to her. A reminder of the years she had spent in the shadows of others' choices, and of the quiet, painful revenge she had taken, not just on Vanessa, but on herself. She reached the end of the street, stopping beneath the arch of an old oak tree where the wind rustled through the leaves, a whisper of what was to come. Her chest rose and fell in slow, deliberate breaths as she turned to face Gavin one last time. "They built their marriage on my ruins," she said, her voice a quiet force in the cool night air. "So I made them live inside mine." Gavin said nothing. He simply watched her, the faintest trace of a smile playing at the corner of his mouth. He understood. They both did. And as she turned and continued walking, her steps light, the camera lingered a moment longer on the empty street behind her, the rain washing it all clean. Then, the scene slowly faded to black.